On the night of March 9, 1945, Tokyo became a furnace. The quiet hum of the city was shattered when American bombers roared across the skies, dropping thousands of firebombs that turned streets into rivers of flame. Within hours, entire neighborhoods vanished, swallowed by firestorms hotter than steel furnaces. Civilians had no warning, no escape. Mothers clutched children as the oxygen was sucked from the air, fathers fought desperately to carve paths through burning debris, and the once proud capital of Japan collapsed into a nightmare of smoke and ash. This was not Hiroshima. This was not Nagasaki. This was a different kind of destruction, one that the Japanese had never imagined possible. For the people of Tokyo, that night was more than an air raid. It was the night their world ended in fire, and their enemy revealed a new, terrifying face of war. Before the atomic bombs, before Hiroshima and Nagasaki became symbols of ultimate destruction, there was Tokyo, a city that endured the deadliest air raid of the Second World War. On the night of March 9, 1945, American B-29 bombers unleashed a storm of fire that would burn with such ferocity, it erased entire districts from the map in a single night. The plan was simple but brutal: strike not with precision, but with overwhelming flames, targeting the wooden heart of Japan's capital where millions lived. For the Japanese people, it was a horror they never believed possible. Their skies, once symbols of divine protection, rained fire instead. Their homes, shops, and shrines collapsed into cinders. More than 100,000 lives were lost in just a few hours, a devastation greater than most single battles of the war. This was not only a military operation, it was psychological warfare. America sought to break Japan's spirit before invading its shores. But in doing so, they carved scars that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. To understand Tokyo's firebombing is to confront one of history's darkest truths. Sometimes victory is written not in strategy, but in ashes. In early 1945, Japan stood on the edge of collapse. Its empire, once vast and proud, was shrinking under the relentless pressure of Allied advances. The Pacific War had already taken a devastating toll. Islands once thought impenetrable had fallen one after another. American submarines prowled the seas, strangling Japan's trade routes, and food shortages gnawed at the population daily. Yet, inside Tokyo, life carried on in fragile defiance. Families cooked meager meals, children attended makeshift schools, and workers continued their duties under strict government control. Tokyo itself was a city of contradictions. It was modern in some corners, trains, radios, factories, but still deeply traditional in its construction. Most homes were built of wood and paper, with narrow streets weaving between them. These materials made the city vulnerable in ways its citizens barely considered. To them, the war was already difficult, but few could imagine that their very homes would soon become their greatest weakness. The Japanese government fueled a sense of resilience with propaganda. Newspapers declared victories even in defeat, and radio broadcasts urged civilians to believe in the divine protection of the emperor. Many citizens clung to this faith. They whispered that Japan could not fall, that the spirit of the nation was unbreakable. But deep down, unease spread. The firebombing of smaller cities like Nagoya and Osaka had already begun, and rumors drifted into Tokyo about entire neighborhoods reduced to ash. Still, Tokyo was the heart of the nation. People believed it was untouchable. Its size, importance, and cultural weight seemed to shield it from the worst. Parents tucked their children into bed, workers returned from factories, and soldiers in uniform marched through the streets, all unaware that within weeks, their capital would become the target of the most destructive air raid in history. The stage was set. America had studied the city, calculated its vulnerabilities, and designed a plan unlike any the world had seen before. For the Japanese, life before the firebombing was filled with hardship but also with fragile hope. That hope, however, was about to be consumed by fire. By early 1945, the United States had grown impatient. Conventional bombing of Japanese factories and military sites had not achieved the results they wanted. Japan's industry was scattered across small workshops hidden within neighborhoods, making precision bombing ineffective. General Curtis LeMay, commander of the XXI Bomber Command, believed a new approach was needed, one that would not simply target weapons production but would break the will of the Japanese nation itself. The plan he devised was both daring and devastating. Instead of high-altitude daylight raids, which Japanese defenses had adapted to, LeMay ordered low-altitude night bombings. Flying at only 5,000 to 7,000 feet, American B-29 superfortresses would drop incendiary bombs designed to ignite massive fires across densely populated wooden cities. These bombs were not just explosives. They were small canisters of jellied gasoline, napalm, and magnesium. Once released, they scattered in clusters, sticking to surfaces, burning hotter and longer than anything civilians had ever witnessed. Tokyo, with its tightly packed wooden houses, narrow streets, and limited firefighting resources, was the perfect target. U.S. planners knew this. The objective was clear: create a firestorm so intense that the city itself would become a weapon against its own people. The wind would spread the flames, oxygen would feed the Inferno, and the crowded neighborhoods would provide the fuel. This was more than a military operation, it was psychological warfare. American strategists wanted to crush Japan's morale, making civilians lose faith in their government and forcing leaders to surrender without an invasion. LeMay himself admitted that the plan was brutal but argued it was necessary to shorten the war. "If we lose," he once remarked coldly, "we'll be tried as war criminals." The Japanese military had prepared for traditional bombing, but they were unready for this new strategy. Their anti-aircraft guns were designed to hit high-altitude bombers, not low-flying waves of aircraft coming under the cover of night. Their firefighting systems were outdated, their civil defense drills weak, and their propaganda-driven confidence left them blind to the scale of destruction about to fall upon them. On paper, the mission looked terrifyingly efficient. Hundreds of bombers, loaded with incendiaries, would blanket Tokyo's eastern districts. In practice, it would become something even worse, a night of fire so vast it consumed everything in its path. The plan had been drawn, the bombs prepared, and the air crews briefed. The stage was set for March 9, 1945, the night Tokyo would burn like no other city in modern history. The night of March 9, 1945, began like any other in Tokyo. Families sat in their homes, children drifted to sleep, and workers returned from exhausting shifts at factories. Some glanced at the sky, nervous about the possibility of bombers, but none could imagine what was about to descend upon them. At 10:30 p.m., the first wave of American B-29s approached the city, their engines a low growl that grew louder with every passing second. Suddenly, the darkness was pierced by hundreds of glowing flares. They fell slowly, bathing entire districts in eerie red and white light. These flares marked the targets, guiding the waves of bombers that followed. Civilians looked up in horror as the sky itself seemed to ignite. Then came the sound, the metallic clatter of thousands of incendiary canisters falling through the air, followed by the explosions that ripped apart the silence of the night. Within minutes, Tokyo was ablaze. Wooden houses burst into flames as the incendiaries spread, clinging to walls, roofs, and even human skin. The narrow streets acted as chimneys, sucking the fire higher and higher until entire blocks were swallowed. The wind carried the flames faster than people could run. Survivors described how the air itself seemed to catch fire, searing their lungs with every breath. Panic swept through the city. Mothers grabbed children and ran barefoot through the burning streets. Fathers tried desperately to dig through rubble, searching for trapped relatives. Families jumped into canals and rivers to escape the inferno, but even the water offered little safety. The heat was so intense that oxygen near the surface was consumed, suffocating those who sought refuge. Others were boiled alive as incendiaries fell directly into the waterways. Eyewitnesses later recalled seeing human shadows burned into the walls of buildings, outlines of people who had no time to flee. The firestorm grew so powerful that it created its own wind system, pulling people into the flames as though the city itself was breathing death. Entire neighborhoods collapsed, and the sound of screaming filled the night air. By midnight, Tokyo had become a sea of fire. From above, American pilots reported seeing a city glowing like the surface of the sun. Even they were stunned by the scale of destruction unfolding below. For civilians, there was no safe place. Temples, schools, hospitals, and homes all burned alike. The firestorm did not distinguish between soldier or child, factory or shrine. When dawn finally broke, the once crowded eastern districts of Tokyo had been reduced to smoldering ruins. Nearly 16 square miles of the capital had been obliterated in a single raid. Where life had thrived just hours before, now only ashes remained. For the survivors, it was not simply the loss of their homes or families. It was the realization that their world, their capital, their pride, could be erased in a single night of fire. When the firestorm engulfed Tokyo, survival became a desperate gamble. No warning, no training, no preparation could have readied civilians for what they endured that night. What followed were not just statistics of death, but countless human tragedies etched forever in memory. Mothers clutched their infants to their chests, running blindly through the flames, their feet scorched by the burning streets. Some made it to rivers and canals, believing the water would protect them. But the inferno was merciless. Survivors described the rivers boiling, packed so tightly with bodies that some drowned before they ever touched the fire. Entire families vanished beneath the surface, never to rise again. One eyewitness recalled stumbling upon a school where dozens of children had been hidden for safety. When the fire reached them, there was no escape. The flames consumed the wooden building in minutes, leaving behind only ashes and silence. The smell of charred wood mixed with something more horrifying, the unmistakable stench of burning flesh. Fathers tried to lead their families through the chaos, only to watch in despair as loved ones were separated by collapsing buildings or choking smoke. Some survivors later admitted to abandoning children or spouses in panic, choices that haunted them for the rest of their lives. In the firestorm, morality collapsed into raw instinct: run, breathe, survive. Those who managed to flee into open fields found no safety there either. Incendiary bombs had blanketed the ground, sticking to skin and clothing. Survivors tore at their burning clothes, some rolling in dirt to extinguish the flames, others screaming in agony as the fire clung stubbornly to their flesh. For many, survival meant living with lifelong scars, both physical and psychological. Temples, once places of refuge, became tombs. Crowds rushed inside, believing sacred walls would protect them, but fire showed no reverence. Roofs collapsed, suffocating smoke filled the air, and prayers turned into cries of despair. Hospitals too, filled with wounded and sick, went up in flames, trapping both patients and doctors alike. Yet amid the devastation, stories of resilience emerged. A young girl, separated from her family, crawled through rubble and flames, guided only by the cries of others. She survived, though her entire neighborhood was erased. A father carried his unconscious son through burning streets, his body blistered but his will unbroken, determined to save at least one life from the inferno. By morning, the survivors walked through a landscape that no longer resembled a city. The silence was heavy, broken only by the crackle of dying flames and the sobs of the living. Corpses lay everywhere, on streets, in rivers, in collapsed homes. Many were unrecognizable, their faces erased by fire. For those who lived, survival was not victory. It was the beginning of a lifetime haunted by visions of fire, screams, and the knowledge that their world had ended in a single night. When dawn broke on March 10, 1945, the people of Tokyo emerged into a nightmare. The once bustling capital was now a field of smoldering ruins, bodies scattered in rivers, streets, and alleys. Survivors wandered in shock, their clothes burned to rags, their faces covered in soot, their eyes empty from what they had witnessed. For ordinary Japanese civilians, the raid was not only a disaster, it was a revelation. The war that had once felt distant had now reached their very doorsteps with unimaginable cruelty. Word of the devastation spread quickly, carried by refugees fleeing the city. In villages and towns nearby, whispers told of Tokyo erased in a single night, of families gone without a trace. Fear spread as people realized that if the heart of the empire could burn, nowhere was safe. Many began to question the government's constant assurances of victory. If divine winds had once saved Japan from Mongol invasions, why had no such miracle stopped the American firestorms? Inside the Japanese government, reactions were divided. Military leaders attempted to suppress the full scale of destruction, fearing the truth would shatter morale completely. Propaganda framed the raid as proof of American brutality, urging civilians to fight harder, to sacrifice more. Posters appeared declaring that every death would be avenged, that Japan's spirit could not be broken by fire. Yet in private, many officials were shaken. The sheer scale of civilian casualties, greater than the deaths from both Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined, revealed a terrifying weakness. Emperor Hirohito was informed of the raid's results, but reports were softened by cautious advisors. Even so, he expressed deep concern. For the first time, the emperor and his court recognized that Tokyo itself could not be defended. Military commanders scrambled to adjust defenses, but they knew the truth: Japan lacked the resources, fuel, and weapons to stop wave after wave of B-29 bombers. Anti-aircraft guns were outdated, fighter planes too few, and radar systems inadequate. Among civilians, anger grew alongside despair. Many blamed the government for failing to protect them, for leading the nation into a war it could not win. Survivors whispered criticisms in private, though public dissent remained dangerous. Still, the firebombing left scars not just on the body, but on the mind of a nation. The illusion of invincibility had been shattered. For Japan's leaders, the raid was a brutal warning of what was to come. For its people, it was a wound that would never fully heal, proof that their empire was crumbling and that the enemy's reach was limitless. From the American side, the firebombing of Tokyo was seen not only as a military operation but as a grim necessity. By 1945, the war in the Pacific had already claimed countless lives, and the prospect of invading Japan's home islands promised even greater losses. Military planners estimated that a full-scale invasion could cost up to 1 million American casualties, along with millions of Japanese lives. To them, any strategy that could break Japan's resistance before an invasion was worth pursuing, no matter the cost in civilian suffering. General Curtis LeMay became the architect of this brutal solution. He argued that the key to victory was destroying Japan's capacity to fight by targeting its cities directly. Unlike Germany, where industries were concentrated in large factories, Japan's war production was dispersed into small workshops hidden within neighborhoods. That meant the entire city, homes, schools, shops, was part of the war machine. In his eyes, attacking civilians was not collateral damage, it was strategy. The American crews who carried out the mission were also aware of the stakes. Some believed they were saving lives in the long run by forcing Japan to surrender sooner. Others admitted unease as they looked down at the Inferno, realizing that beneath the flames were not soldiers, but families. Reports from pilots described the burning city as a sheet of fire, visible for miles, with smoke rising higher than their planes. Even seasoned airmen were stunned by the sheer scale of destruction. Back in Washington, officials viewed the raid as a success. 16 square miles of Tokyo had been destroyed, over 100,000 civilians killed, and Japan's morale deeply shaken. Newspapers in the United States carried headlines about the raid, presenting it as evidence that the war was nearing its end. For a nation weary of years of bloodshed, this was framed as progress, a necessary step toward victory. Yet, behind closed doors, not everyone was comfortable. Some questioned the morality of targeting civilians on such a scale. Was this truly different from the atrocities America condemned in its enemies? LeMay himself later admitted, with chilling honesty, "If we lose this war, we'll be tried as war criminals." But in 1945, America was winning, and victory overshadowed doubt. To the U.S. government, the firebombing of Tokyo was justified by strategy and necessity. To the Japanese people, it was proof that their enemy wielded fire not just as a weapon of war, but as a weapon of terror. The firebombing of Tokyo left scars that stretched far beyond the charred ruins of 1945. In a single night, more than 100,000 civilians perished, and over 1 million were left homeless. 16 square miles of the capital vanished, replaced by ash and silence. But the legacy of this destruction was not only measured in numbers, it lived on in memory, in debate, and in the moral questions that still haunt historians today. For the Japanese people, the raid became a symbol of unimaginable suffering. Survivors carried physical scars from burns, and deeper wounds within their hearts. Families that once gathered under one roof were scattered forever, and entire neighborhoods that had stood for centuries disappeared. For decades after the war, Tokyo's rebuilding efforts could not erase the haunting memory of that night when fire rained from the sky. Internationally, the firebombing raised questions about the limits of warfare. Unlike Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which entered global consciousness as the first atomic tragedies, Tokyo's destruction was often overlooked. Yet, in terms of casualties, it was even more devastating. Scholars continue to argue, was it a military necessity that hastened the end of the war, or a war crime committed under the banner of victory? In America, the raid was remembered as part of the larger campaign that forced Japan to surrender. Supporters argued that it saved lives by avoiding an invasion of the Japanese mainland. Critics countered that the deliberate targeting of civilians blurred the line between strategy and atrocity. Even General Curtis LeMay admitted, years later, that had the United States lost the war, he and his men would likely have been tried as criminals. In Japan today, the firebombing is commemorated quietly. Memorials honor the dead, and survivors gather to tell their stories, ensuring that the horror is not forgotten. For many, the tragedy is not only about loss but also about resilience, the ability of a nation to rise from ashes, to rebuild, and to remember. The legacy of the firebombing remains a paradox. It was both a turning point in the war and a wound on humanity's conscience. A night when victory was written in fire, and the price was paid in innocent lives. The firebombing of Tokyo on March 9 to 10, 1945, remains one of the darkest nights in human history. It was not just a military operation, nor simply another battle in the long war. It was a deliberate act designed to break a nation's spirit by reducing its capital to ashes, and in doing so, it revealed the true cost of modern warfare, where civilians became the battlefield. For the survivors, that night never truly ended. Long after the flames were extinguished, the memories lived on. Mothers recalled the screams of their children swallowed by fire. Fathers lived with the guilt of choices made in desperation, whom to save, whom to leave behind. Children grew into adulthood haunted by nightmares of running through burning streets. The scars of Tokyo were not only physical, they were etched deep into the psyche of an entire generation. For Japan as a nation, the raid was a moment of reckoning. The propaganda of invincibility shattered. Faith in the emperor's protection was shaken. The firebombing exposed the vulnerability of a people who had been taught to believe in eternal victory. It showed that no shrine, no school, no neighborhood was beyond the reach of war. From that night forward, the Japanese knew that surrender was not only possible, it was inevitable. For America, the legacy was complex. On the one hand, the mission was hailed as a success, a strategic blow that crippled Japan's war machine and brought the Allies closer to victory. On the other, it opened moral wounds that have never fully healed. Could the deliberate incineration of civilians be justified as a means to end the war? Was the suffering of over 100,000 innocent lives a necessary price for peace? These questions echo even today, unanswered but impossible to ignore. Historians often point out that the Tokyo firebombing was, in many ways, more devastating than the atomic bombings that followed. Yet, unlike Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it rarely appears in global memory with the same weight. Perhaps because it involved no single, iconic weapon, no mushroom cloud frozen in photographs. Instead, It was a storm of fire, an inferno too vast to capture in a single image, too overwhelming for the world to fully comprehend. But forgetting is dangerous. The lesson of Tokyo is not only about war's brutality but about humanity's choices. Technology and strategy may win battles, but they also magnify suffering when guided by ruthless necessity. The night Tokyo burned should remind us that war is not fought by soldiers alone, it is endured by civilians who pay the heaviest price. In the end, the firebombing of Tokyo was both a victory and a tragedy, both a step toward ending the war and a stain on humanity's conscience. It forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth, that in war, the line between heroism and horror is often drawn in fire. As we remember that night, we are left with one enduring question: if such destruction was called necessary once, how far might nations go in the future when they again choose between victory and mercy?